Hello and welcome to Dice and Demons. I'm Emma, and in this video I'm going to show you how I scratch built and painted an Ork Trukk. And the reason for doing this was that I had a game of 40k this week and I was completely blown off the board by the Eldar before my boys even got the chance to get into melee, and I thought that is not a great look for the orcs. They need something to help them get into battle a little bit earlier and a little bit quicker, and so for that I need a truck. And of course I could just, buy the official Games Workshop model, but I also thought it would be quite fun to just try and scratch build my own. I haven't scratch built a lot of stuff for the orcs, but the few times I've done it, it has actually been really fun, so I decided to just make a project out of it and see where that would take me. So I got the rough measurements of the Ork Trukk from the great interwebs, and I drew a quick plan of it using more or less the correct measurements. I'm not quite sure. I perhaps think in the end it ended up being just a little bit bigger than it was actually supposed to be, but I mean, this is an orc vehicle, who cares, right? So as you can see, I just used some sturdy cardboard as the basis for my Ork Trukk. I drew the back end first, which is just one big square because it needs to be able to hold a lot of orcs, and then I just drew the front a little bit smaller than the back end, just to give it a little bit more of a pleasing look and also add a little bit of visual interest. I had a very helpful orc boy, as you can see, by my side to help me figure out if the front part would actually be big enough to fit an orc boy, because I definitely wanted to have a driver in place, and that's what I based most of my drawings on. I then took another piece of cardboard. This is a little bit thinner and a little bit less sturdy, but on the other hand it's easier to work with, and I used that for cutting out the sides of the truck. I did some rough measurements and then I just more or less eyeballed it and tried to see what would fit. You could be very precise with stuff like this, but I mean, this is for an Ork Trukk, so I don't mind if it's a little bit ramshackle. And for projects such as this, I tend to find that if I give myself the goal of being very accurate and very going for a sort of a perfect look at the end, I get hit by you might say decision paralysis. I don't know where to start and where to end and what to do in between, and so nothing gets done. And so I usually approach stuff like this with an "that's probably good enough" attitude, and that helps me to keep going and also have fun and enjoy the process. The front end of the car felt just a little bit too delicate, so I filled it up with a bit of tinfoil just to make it that much more sturdy. And I mean, it should have been filled with an engine, of course, but this is an Ork Trukk after all, and it runs on make-believe anyway, so I think it's somehow quite fitting that it's just filled up with tinfoil. I wanted the back end of the truck to be open-topped so that the orcs can stand there and look out and also shoot at the enemies. I know orc shooting is terrible, but I still thought they should at least have the chance. So I got some wood, and I thought this was balsa wood when I bought it at the store. It turned out it's a bit of a harder wood, so it's a little bit more tricky to work with, but on the other hand, I guess it will take just a little bit more of a beating before it snaps, which is probably all good. This is after all going to be a gaming piece and not something for display or anything. So I cut a bunch of these into roughly the same lengths and then glued them onto the side of the truck using super glue. You can see here I put them at the outside of the truck because I thought it would look cool and also give me a little bit more space to work with. But then it turned out that that was a really stupid idea because they were totally fragile and would just snap off. So I just took them off and decided to do something else later on. I didn't want the floor of the truck to just be the plain old cardboard. I thought that would look a little bit off. So I got out some metal mesh and I glued that in place instead. And once it was dry, it was really easy just to take out my scissors and cut it into shape. I then reattached the beams to the back of the truck using super glue, as you can see here, and then I cut out some planks using balsa wood that would help secure the whole thing. I didn't want it to be an entire big sort of wall of wooden planks, but I thought at least they would work well as the first layer, just to make sure everything would more or less stay where I wanted it to stay. After having added some planks to the back of the truck, I decided to work on the cabin and decorating that a little bit. And for that, I used some molds from Green Stuff World. This one is called control panels. And I just used that as decoration inside the cabin, so it wouldn't just be one big empty hollow. Next up, it was time to add some wheels to the truck. And I had first thought that perhaps I could do them myself, like sculpt them by hand, but then I ended up not going down that route just because it would be really time consuming and probably wouldn't look that great. And so the big wheels are actually Lego wheels that I looted from my daughter's box of Legos. Well, I didn't really loot them. I got her permission. Don't steal your kids' toys without permission. And the smaller wheels are from my bits box. I then painted the front end of the truck with a mixture of white glue and plaster, both to help seal it and hide some of the cracks, give it a little bit more durability, and also add a little bit of texture that would make it easier to paint up nicely later on. At this point, I thought the truck looked just a little bit bland and boring, and so I decided to add some chain to it. I don't think you can ever really go wrong with adding chains to a Warhammer 40,000 project, and especially not one that is for the orcs. With the body of the truck being complete, I then got out some plastic card and started cutting out some armor plates that I wanted to cover the entire thing. I didn't do any measurements or anything, I just cut them out into rough shapes that I thought would look fun and suitably orky. I of course also cut out a whole bunch of spikes to add to the armor plates, both because it looks fun and because I don't think any orc project is really complete without spikes. Another thing that is an absolute must-have on an orc build is of course rivets. So I got out this mold I have from Green Stuff World, which is called rivets. And I used that for creating a whole bunch of these little dudes so that I could put them onto the armor plates. And I know that a lot of times people will say less is more, but I think when it comes to rivets and orc builds, there is no such thing as too many rivets. So I just added a whole bunch. After having painted up the body of the truck just using some really simple techniques, I sprayed it black and used a lot of dry brushing and a bit of contrast paint on the wood. I decided I needed a platform on the back of the truck where I could place an orc boy with a big shooter so that he could have a nice view of the battlefield and hopefully hit at least a single guardsman or a single Eldar soldier or something. I don't have a lot of hopes for him, but I mean, at least he gets a fair chance, right? Next up, I got out a bunch of my orc bits. These are by no means all of my orc bits, just some of the smaller ones. And I decided to use them for building a wrecking ball. It says in the weapons profile on the truck that it can have a wrecking ball, and so of course my truck needed to include that. But I didn't have one on hand, which is a little bit weird. I mean, everyone should have at least a couple of wrecking balls in their inventory, right? Well, I didn't, so I decided to build one myself, and for that I wanted to use some spare weapons that I had lying around from my orcs. I chose some of the bigger knives and some of the boomsticks, and I glued them together, trying to make sure they had a nice fit and would be relatively durable. But it was just very fiddly and it was quite time consuming trying to hold them in place, and I'm not a very patient person, so I ended up being really annoyed with the whole thing and decided to do something completely different. Instead of just waiting around for every single little thing to dry, I added a bit of chain, wrapped it around the whole thing and used some super glue, and then just put more and more boomsticks and swords into place as I went along, trying to make it relatively round, but at the same time not spending, hours trying to get it just right. This is, after all, a wrecking ball for orcs. I then built a sort of scaffolding that it could hang from the back end of the truck, again using some of the balsa wood and some of the wooden sticks I had. With most of the building process being done, I could finally start painting. I had primed the armor panels using the Wraithbone spray from Citadel, and I decided I wanted to go with 3 different colors for the armor plates. And the first one I chose was Sigwald Burgundy, which is a sort of darker pinkish color from the contrast paint range. It was perhaps slightly too dark actually, but I was painting this at my friend's house, and so I hadn't brought anything else, so I just decided to go for it, and I think it ended up working relatively well. The next color I decided to add was orange, and for that I used Magma Drop Flame, which is also a contrast paint. And finally I decided to go for blue as the third color. I thought that would contrast very well with the orange, while at the same time working relatively well with the pink, and so give both a bit of visual interest while at the same time not being completely off-putting to the eye to look at. I also wanted to have some hazard stripes on one of the armor panels, and so I just used a pencil to draw in the design. You could definitely be much more accurate and measure it out to make sure that it was completely the way you wanted it to be, but this is for orcs and it's for a tabletop, so I didn't really mind just eyeballing it. I also wanted to add some checkers to one of the armor panels, and both because I think it looks cool and because it's a very classic look for the orcs. Again, you could do this much more accurately if you wanted to and measure everything out using a ruler or something, but I thought this would probably be completely fine for an Ork Trukk that is going to be played on a tabletop. For the hazard stripes, I first used a black color. This is Black Templar, also a contrast paint. And I had watered it down just a little bit to make sure that it wasn't too dark so that I could also later on add some shadows. I also used the Black Templar on half of the checkered patterns, as you can see here. I could have used, let's say, the blue and orange, and that would certainly look striking, but I was afraid it would get just a tiny bit too busy, perhaps. For the wrecking ball, I had sprayed it black, and then I did a quick dry brushing using some Iron Hand steel. If you really wanted to paint this up very, very nicely, you could definitely do other colors for the handles of the swords and everything, but this is a wrecking ball and it's going to be seen mostly from a distance, so I decided not to do that. I wanted something that would look cool on a tabletop and not something, as I said, that would be suitable for a display piece or anything. One detail I did want to add though was a bit of blood spatter, so I took some blood for the blood god from Citadel, and using an old toothbrush I did just a bunch of tiny little sprays. The toothbrush works really well because it has a bit of spring in it, so it makes sure that you get a very nice random blood spatter pattern. I wanted the wrecking ball to hang off the side of the truck, but I also soon realized that just gluing it in place like this would mean that it would be very fragile when I was transporting it, let's say, to and from a store for a game. And so I decided to build in some supports using a little bit more of the wooden sticks so that it would stay in place during a game, but then also be removable so that I could transport it a little bit more safely and easily. With the wrecking ball sorted out, that's actually quite a weird sentence, but okay, I went back to painting, and the other part of the hazard stripes I decided to paint orange, and I again used the Magma Drop Flame for that. For the other part of the checkers, I chose to go with pink, and I again used the Sigwald Burgundy. You can see it looks a little bit messy right now, but as I will be adding both shadows and highlights, it'll look hopefully a little bit more clean once it's all done. Then I started to add some shadows, and for the blue and pink part I used Achillean green, and I applied it to the lower half of the armor plates in a sort of cross-hatching pattern, both because that is what fits with the rest of the orc army I have painted up, but also just because I think it looks cool and add a little bit of visual interest to something that is otherwise just a very plain piece of plastic. I also used the Achillean green to add shadows to the pink part of the checkers, though here I did not do a full cross-hatching pattern. I only just added diagonal lines in one direction because I thought it would make them look a little bit more cohesive and a little bit less busy. Using the same paint, I then added a dark outline around each armor plate that was painted pink or blue, and I did this because I think it adds a little bit more of visual interest, and it also makes each armor plate a bit more distinct when you look at it and makes the model somewhat easier to read, I find. I then added shadows to the orange armor plates using the exact same methods, only this time I wasn't using Achillean green, but I was using Grunter Fur, which is also a contrast paint. I also added shadows to the orange part of the hazard stripes using Grunter Fur. I painted a dark outline of the lower part of the hazard stripe, and then I added patterns using the cross-hatching technique. Next up, I grabbed some Black Legion contrast paint, which is a lot darker than the Black Templar, and I did the exact same thing as I did with the Gold Contrefeur on the orange part, using a black outline to show where the bottom part of the stripe is, and then using cross-hatching to add some shadows. I also used the Black Legion for adding shadows to the black part of the checkers. After all the shadows were painted, it was finally time to start highlighting, which is probably the part of the painting process I enjoy the most. For the orange, I used a paint called Laser Orange from Huge Miniatures. It is a fluorescent paint and it's a much more vibrant color in real life, but on camera, unfortunately, it looks just a little bit dulled down. I really like the paints from Huge Miniatures, and I have a discount code that will give you 5% off, and I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. It's a way for you to save a little bit of money if you want some fluorescent paints, and also a way for you to help support the channel. I also used the Laser Orange, as you can see here, to do an edge highlight of all the orange parts of the armor. I also used the Laser Orange on the top half of the hazard stripes to really help sell the illusion of light and shadow and depth, and again doing the highlights using the cross-hatching technique. For the first layer of highlights on the blue parts of the armor, I used Blaster Blue, which is also a fluorescent paint from Huge Miniatures. I think I should probably have added a little bit of white or something to the paint, because it was just a little bit too close to the original base color, but yeah, there you go. I also used the Blaster Blue, as you can see here, to do an edge highlight. I then used Monitorum Grey, which is a paint from Citadel, to do the highlights on the grey or black parts of the armor, both as you can see here on the hazard stripes and also on the checkers. Next up, I started adding some highlights to the pink parts of the armor, and for that I used a paint called Pulse Wave Pink, which is also from Huge Miniatures. I then used the same color to draw an outline around the blue parts of the armor, as you can see here, because I thought it would again help the armor plates to stand out visually from each other, and also add a little bit more of depth to the whole thing, and again make it perhaps just a little bit easier for the viewer to read the model, to see what is actually going on and where each armor plate starts and where the other one begins. The Pulse Wave Pink was also used, of course, to highlight the pink parts of the checkers patterns. And again, I did a sort of edge highlight surrounding each half of the square. And then I did some diagonal lines to show where the light would be hitting it from above. Of course, this illusion of light and shadow is a little bit silly on a model such as this, where I'm not going for anything just remotely resembling realism, but I still think it helps sell the idea and help just make it a little bit cooler to look at. I then mixed up the Blaster Blue with a little bit of white paint, because as I said, the first layer was perhaps just a little bit too subtle and not really easy to spot. And so I used that for the top half of the model, and I also added the lighter mix to the edges of the armor panel, especially as you can see here on the corners, to make them stand out a little bit more. For the last layer of highlights on the orange parts of the armor, I used Starfire Yellow, which is a very cool neon yellow from Huge Miniatures. And as you can see, I try only to use it here at the top part of the armor, and it's not because, as I said, with the checkers pattern, that I'm going for a realistic look at all. It's just that making it look slightly like there's some feeling that the way the colors are placed on the armor plates, it makes a little bit of sense to the eye, makes the model a little bit easier to read, and makes it look a little bit less chaotic and messy than it might otherwise do. Well, at least that's what I think. I'm not quite sure everyone agrees. I know this painting style certainly isn't for everyone. As you can see here, I also used the Starfire Yellow on the hazard stripes just to add that last bit of highlight and really make them pop. For the gray or black parts of the armor, like here on the hazard stripes, I mixed a little bit of the monochrome gray with some white, and the white paint I'm using is matte white from the Army Painter, and I used that for the final layer of highlights here. It's a little bit difficult to say if that makes the gray or black armor really pop like with the neon colors, but I do feel it helps give the sense that there is some sort of cohesive look with the rest of the armor plates at least. And I of course added the same mixture to the corners of each square on the checkers pattern, as you can see here. Again, trying to make sure that I only hit sort of the very tip of the corner of each square, just because I don't want them to suddenly start looking like they are more white than gray or black, but it needs to look like it's a highlight. I then went over the pink armor once more and did the second layer of highlights, and for that I used a color called Cyber Pink, which is also from Huge Miniatures. People often ask me about the consistency of my paints for doing the cross-hatching patterns, and I like to keep them relatively thick because it makes it a little bit easier for me to control the paint, and I'm not going for a big smooth area. Like if I was doing something on a tank, for instance, and I wanted to do smooth gradients, I would definitely thin down the color quite a lot to make it more to give it more of the consistency of a glaze, for instance. But when I'm doing patterns such as these, I try to not thin it down too much because it just makes it so much easier for me to make sure that it stays exactly where I want it to stay. And whether or not it looks smooth doesn't really matter much because, I mean, these are after all just thin lines crisscrossing across the entire surface. I use the same paint, as you can see here, also for highlighting the pink squares in the checkers, and I tried not to overdo it. Again, I don't want this to look too much like a pastel that is suddenly just taking over the entire pattern. I want it to look like a highlight. My original plan was just to stop there and leave it at 2 layers of highlights, but I thought it just needed a little bit more, so I mixed in some of the matte white from the Army Painter with the Cyber Pink and gave it just a final touch. After I was done painting, I took a piece of clear plastic. I have a huge sheet of this that I bought at some hardware store and that I use also for when I'm doing these springy bases, and I decided that that would work really well as a windshield for my car. And I also wanted it to look slightly damaged, well, not slightly damaged, quite damaged. And as you can see here, I put a driver in the front of the truck, and he has a gun that he's sort of reaching out in front, and it doesn't really fit within the framework of where the windshield would go, but I don't think that matters too much because I can just I'll just cut a hole in the windshield. I think that is very orky. Either someone has shot at him and he is now using the hole as an opportunity for shooting out, or he has just broken it himself to make room for his gun. I don't know which is more orky, but anyway, I decided I wanted a windshield with lots and lots of holes, and so I carved it out using a hobby knife. It was a little bit fiddly, so if you want to do this yourself, take good care that you don't accidentally cut yourself. After I had cut out the broken pieces of glass, I decided to do just a little bit more damage to the windshield. I imagined that it's like when you're driving in your car and a stone hits the glass, it sort of has small nick or cracks in the glass if you're really unlucky. So I thought that would look really cool, and I just used the hobby knife, as you can see, to almost draw some lines of damage here, which was quite fun. There is just something very satisfying about destroying a piece of glass that you're going to apply to an Ork vehicle, I think. Perhaps that's just me. And here you can see the final result, and I have to say this was a really fun project. It took me about 4 days to build and paint this thing, which I think is relatively quick since, I mean, I didn't spend every single waking hour building or painting, and it was just kind of relaxing to just get out all my bits and pieces of cardboard and plastic card and what have you and throw it all together, and this is what materialized. And then after I was done building it, I just threw a lot of neon paints at it, and this is what ended up being the result, and I think it's quite fun. And of course, as you can see here with the neon paints, it has the added benefit of glowing under a UV light, which, as I've said so many times before, has no practical application whatsoever, but it's just fun, and I like to imagine that my orcs also enjoy the idea of going to a rave party in their stylish new truck. You can also see here I added a license plate with the WA1 because I think I'm going to need more trucks, so this obviously has to have a number so that we can separate it from the other trucks. I think the other trucks will also be scratch built, so they probably won't be an exact replica of this one, but I still thought it would be fun. I'm also really interested in hearing what you guys think of this project, this video, how it was put together, because I have to admit it was really difficult for me because it was just, it was really a process where I just went with what I thought would be fun and cool to do at the time, and so that made the whole process a little bit messy, and it was also difficult to film and record and edit. So if you have any suggestions for how to do this better in the future, I would very much appreciate it. Bearing in mind though that I'm just, well, myself in my tiny little hobby room, and I don't have like a huge crew or anything to help me out. I'm just me. So of course I can't make videos in the highest possible quality. I would love to do so, but at the moment that's simply not possible. But still, if you have any suggestions, I would love to hear them. Also, of course, if you have questions about techniques or colors or anything, let me know and I'll do my very best to get back to you on that as well. Before we end this video, I would just like to take the opportunity to thank the lovely people who support this channel on Patreon. So thank you to Thomas Madsen, Scott Broadway, Andrew Correa, Anthony Polcastro, Queen's Wolf, JJ Waltz, Gwenna L, Mola Mola, TJ Kubiak, Mando Project, Starcon85, Espear, Economicus, Firelord21 and Elliot Philby. Thank you so much, guys. It really means the world to me. If you want to support this channel on Patreon, you can follow the link that I'll leave in the show notes. Also remember, you can follow me as Dyson Demons over on Twitter and Instagram, where you can stay up to date on my painting projects. If you like this video, I of course always appreciate a like and perhaps even a comment and a subscription to the channel as well. So thank you so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye!